The East African country of Kenya has made a proposal for consideration at CITES Conference of the Parties COP16 meeting that hunting trophies from South Africa and Swaziland of the southern white rhino be subject to a zero export quota until at least COP18. The proposal states that it is not their intention to jeopardize the hunting industry in South Africa or Swaziland, a radical departure from their dearly held preservationist philosophy that abhors any form of consumptive utilization of wildlife. Their concern is that pseudo-white rhino tourist hunting is fueling the current poaching scourge. But how is it that one country with a population of 361 southern white rhino, a 2010 estimate, all of which were reintroduced from South Africa and 70% of which occur on private land, can purport to have a solution for another country that has over 18,000 white rhino? If Kenya's wildlife policies are so glorious, why does South Africa have more white rhino than Kenya? Does this have anything to do with their diametrically opposed approach to wildlife management? It is worth examining the state of affairs of wildlife within the two countries.
My name is Mike Norton-Griffiths. I've been here in East Africa in general, Kenya in particular, for some 45 years. I started my career here as a wildlife biologist with the Serengeti Research Institute down in Tanzania, and then moved up here to Kenya. And now I'm a practitioner of the dismal science. I look at land use economics, and I'm particularly interested in the economics of conservation, and especially the difference in economic returns to landowners from agricultural production, livestock production, and wildlife production. Now, I think Kenya shows a textbook example of what happens to a natural resource base when you remove its economic viability. 30 years ago, Kenya had a most extraordinary wildlife conservation policy, very, very broad-based, from strict protection in the national parks and reserves, right through to ranching and cropping and live capture and sales, and of course including sport hunting. And there were all the value-added industries as well, the tanning, taxidermy, curios, all these sorts of things. And then in 1977, all consumptive use of wildlife was banned in Kenya, and the only use you could make of it was through tourism. Now, the extraordinary thing was, in 1977, when this dramatic change in conservation policy occurred, there was also set up something called the Kenya Rangeland Ecological Monitoring Unit, and I was involved with that. I was training all the aerial survey crews. And miraculously, from this major change in policy to today, we also had a way of monitoring the impact of the policy. And year by year by year, CREMU as it was called, it counted livestock and wildlife across all the rangelands of Kenya, the parks, the rangeland areas, the private lands. And year by year by year, we started to see that Kenya was hemorrhaging wildlife. The average rate over the last 35 years has been 4.5% per annum loss. We have now lost 80% of the wildlife that we had, say, 35 years ago. And many of us think that that is strongly correlated, not 100%, but strongly correlated with this reduction in the economic value of wildlife to landowners. Now, it's very interesting to compare Kenya with Southern Africa, and especially South Africa. In the mid-70s, Kenya and South Africa had roughly the same number of wildlife, somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million. Over the next 35 years, Kenya went to full protectionism, no consumptive use of any sort, only tourism. South Africa went the other way, and in De Soto's terms, wildlife became fully fungible, just like livestock. You could trade them, you could buy them, you could sell them, you could eat them, you could do whatever you wanted with them. 35 years later, Kenya has lost 80% of its wildlife. In South Africa, from 1.5 million, whatever it was, there are now over 20 million head of wildlife, and increasing still. There's something like 20,000 wildlife ranches where people, some of them they hunt on them, some is just tourism, some is meat production, on some they just grow wildlife to sell to other ranches. You can buy wildlife from national parks. The whole thing is a viable economic industry, and it's vast in South Africa. Here in Kenya, sadly, we've restricted the economic returns to wildlife, and we've seen wildlife go.
Dr. Ian Player is considered to be one of the most influential driving forces behind Operation Rhino, an exercise that was instrumental in bringing the southern white rhino back from the brink of extinction.
I joined the Natal Parks Board in 1952, the relief ranger. Nobody wanted the job because it meant that you had to move all over the country. But I was delighted because I realized that it would give me a tremendous amount of experience. In 1953, I was instructed to do an aerial count of the white rhino. I spoke to the people who were still doing the Nagana spraying. And there was a chap called Des van Westhuizen. And he then was a young pilot, and he knew Umfolozi Game Reserve like the back of his hand. He'd been flying and spraying there for years and years and years. And he knew exactly where all the rhino were. We counted 437 rhino. And the great problems of Umfolozi at that time was there was no fencing around the reserve, and the rhino were wandering in and out. And that without the addition of some of the Crown lands, or state-owned lands as they became, there was obviously not going to be much hope for the rhino. There were tremendous problems with people who had been moved off the farms who were now coming onto the state-owned lands. And there was a terrible danger of them bringing cattle infected with anthrax, which if they'd have got amongst the rhino, it would have been the end of them. But by 1960, we did another count, and it was something in the region of 600. And then I started to worry, because here we were sitting with all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. So I started to lobby at that time for permission to find some way of catching rhino and moving them elsewhere. It took some doing to convince the board of what our policy was going to be. In essence, it was to, first of all, was to restock the game reserves in Zululand where rhino had been. And then from there to move to the other parks in South Africa, and that's when the first rhino went to the Kruger National Park, 1962, I think. And then from there, we started to take them to the Orange Free State, to Willem Pretoris Game Reserve, and then eventually they went down to the Eastern Cape, and then also to what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. By 1970, the board said, look, we've done everything that it was necessary to do. We've repopulated our own game reserves, we've repopulated the Kruger National Park, and they were breeding fast, and the Willem Pretoris, the Eastern Cape. So really, there's only one thing left now, and that we have too many, we're going to have to cull them in Umfolozi. And I remember saying, over my dead body will that happen, because I knew that there were still markets for them. So I said, no, give me the opportunity of going overseas and let me try and sell them in groups of 20 at a time. It was important that we got animals out of the country in a breeding group.
So here we were, selling rhino overseas, but the proceeds were used to furnish and to finance the translocations locally, which was even more important because it meant we were establishing the rhinos back in their home range and consolidating their status in areas that were previously where they'd been completely decimated. In 1972, we were faced with a prospect. I think there was something like 1,800 rhino now in Umfolozi, which was something like 400 to 500 rhino above carrying capacity. This led the biological research officers to inform us that ecological integrity of the habitat was now threatened, and that we had to move quickly to bring that population down to its carrying capacity.
And that's when we punted the idea of putting them on the hunting list.
The board was, after a great deal of acrimonious debate, persuaded to remove the white rhino from a specially protected status to protected status, where they could be hunted under controlled conditions under permit.
That was the beginning of a whole new era in conservation in this country. And again, here we owe it to the white rhino. It's a tremendous debt that we owe them. Because what happened was ranchers very quickly saw, cattle ranchers very quickly saw that this was an economic thing. I mean, Americans were coming, Europeans were coming, paying $20,000 to shoot a white rhino. The guys were taking the money and then putting it back into the land. And then as the land area increased, they needed more rhino. So this just led to this incredible increase in the number of not only of white rhino, but of land. And a whole new, I don't like the word industry in talking about game, but it was in fact a whole new industry.
And I can remember, before that happening, before the animal was moved onto the protected list from specially protected, a prominent commercial rancher coming into my office with an order for impala, Inyala, wildebeest and zebra to stock his new game ranch. And his reaction to my suggestion that he might like to take a few white rhino at a special price, since we had a growing surplus and we would like him to take a few to establish a herd on his property. He turned around and he said, "What do I want those bloody things for? All they do is they break fences and they cause bad neighbour relations. I don't want them." And I said, "Will you take them at 200 Rand each delivered?" And he said, "I'm not interested. I can't use them. They are no use to me whatsoever." Those pioneers in the hunting industry set the scene. They acted as the catalyst for what was to become a massive industry throughout, a multi-billion rand industry in South Africa. From 200 Rand each delivered, within 10 years, they were 250,000 Rand each, as more and more farmers and agriculturalists on marginal land took the move and saw the gap and invested in fences and restocking of ranches formerly farmed under goats and cattle.
If we look at the land use of this country, 28 million hectares is currently used for the wildlife industry, compared to under government protected areas 7.5 million. So it's about 3 times. Currently we have about 10,000 game ranches, extensive game ranches, fairly big, some of them up to 40,000 hectares. The numbers of game in South Africa on the private ranches exceeds all the national parks game. The national parks games accrued to about 5.5 million, but 16 million heads of game, wild game, are currently found on game ranches. If I look at the yield, and all I'm looking as return on capital, in the arid area of the country, on a conventional grassland, hunting ranches could give me a 10.3%. Compare that to cattle farming on a grassland is only 4.8%. If I look at cattle farming in the lowveld, the return on capital is 0.9% versus 3% for game ranching. If I then go and I combine my hunting ranches with ecotourism, immediately it jumps from a 3% to a 10.9%, or to a 13% in the bushveld. If we go further and I add to the plains games the 6 or 7 esoteric species, buffalo, elephant, etc., at a 500 hectare farm, I would, if I have buffalo, have a return on investment of 19.5%. And if I go in buffalo ranching alone in a lowveld, I would have 21.4%. If I look at the contribution of the wildlife industry to our country's GDP, it now accrues to 9 billion rand per annum. That makes us, as an agricultural commodity, the 5th largest in this country, where chicken accrues about 30 billion followed by red meat, fruit exports, and grain, etc. So we're bigger than sugar and milk and all the others. So as an industry that's sustainable, it shows that it can last.
I do not think that in the annals of conservation history worldwide, there has ever been a species which has contributed so much to conservation and in which the private sector has played such a massive role in a partnership with the formal conservation authorities. And just remember, the private sector is not the only beneficiary. The private sector is the recipient of surplus stock produced under biological management conditions in the formal state protected areas, finite, fenced, no longer able to expand to accommodate more animals. So that surplus stock is being fed into the private sector and growing the herd of white rhino, the meta population, to the extent that it is now 5,000 strong and growing. That relationship is not one-sided. The formal conservation authorities who have those surpluses benefit to the tune of millions and millions of rand from the animals, from the white rhinos sold on auction. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship, the dynamics of which, if it is upset, will be to the detriment of conservation, not only in South Africa, but continent-wide.
Anything that imperils that really is going against conservation. Hunting, we have proved, has led to the increase from that 437 rhino in 1953 to a figure that has been estimated anything from 12,000 to 20,000. For the loss of a few of them, the majority increase. But regrettably, this is a form of logic that a lot of people don't understand.
My name is Michael Tsas-Rolfus. I'm a wildlife resource economist and I work independently. I've been working on the rhino issue for more than 2 decades. My early work in the 1990s looked at the incentives of private rhino owners in South Africa. And what I discovered was very interesting. That was initially when the South African government handed over rhinos to the private sector, they did so at subsidized prices and with relatively little legal protection of private owners' rights. But at the same time, the government had opened up the trophy hunting market in the late 1960s already, and there was a well-established market for trophies. And my research showed that what was happening in the early 1980s is that private owners were acquiring rhinos and having them shot almost immediately. And the reason for this was that the price that they were paying for the rhinos was well below the market value. It was just a list price that just covered the cost of transport. Once they released a rhino onto their property, the rhino, according to Roman Dutch law, was unowned property and ownership could only be claimed if the animal was killed, captured, or domesticated. Now, what was problematic was that it's easy to establish when an animal is killed or domesticated. Capture depended on some precedents in the case law, but for most private game ranches, their land areas were too large to be considered to be a captured enclosure. So according to Roman Dutch law, if you bought or were given a rhino and you released it onto your property, you could no longer claim ownership. So if a poacher came onto the property and shot that rhino, the rhino now belonged to the poacher. So the private landowners had an incentive, once they got their rhinos, to have them shot as soon as possible. And they didn't really have an incentive to breed rhinos. Then what I found is in the mid-1980s there was a dramatic shift once rhinos started going on auction and the price started to climb very quickly. And at the same time there were moves afoot to change the law to actually recognize private legal ownership of rhinos. This would be a game changer because whereas previously if a poacher shot a rhino, You couldn't claim damages against the poacher, now you could. You had stronger legal protection. And the combination of these two factors in the mid-1980s saw the price of a live rhino move from less than 5,000 Rand a rhino to, on the auction markets, up to 50,000 Rands in the space of just 4 years. And all of a sudden, incentives changed. The gap between the trophy price and the live price narrowed significantly. Instead of being 6 times as much, there was only something like a 60% markup. And so private owners all of a sudden had a strong incentive to start breeding rhinos. And the price of live rhinos has increased ever since, until it reached its peak in the year 2008, which is when South Africa's new poaching crisis started. And that has affected things adversely. But trophy hunting has been a very powerful driving force behind rhino conservation in South Africa since the late 1960s, and especially since that change in legislation and market pricing in the late 1980s.
Kenya boasts that each individual of their 300-odd rhino is given 24-hour protection by Kenyan Wildlife Service rangers. Not only would this be impractical in the case of South Africa's population of 20,000 white and black rhino, but the costs would be prohibitive. But what is South Africa doing to combat the rhino poaching problem?
South Africa certainly can't be accused of sitting around and doing nothing in this situation of the rhino at the moment. The situation is largely led by people in Mozambique, a lot of people who are there with military experience and access to military skills and also hardware, and for them they are coming into the Kruger National Park to poach rhinos. In response to that, South Africa, besides increasing the number of rangers and taking into account the IUCN recommendation of having effective enforcement on the ground of 1 ranger per 1,000 hectares, and that is what they're gearing up to. Obviously impossible in the Kruger National Park because of its size, but certainly upping their numbers. They've increased their ranger numbers enormously in the last couple of years. They've improved their selection process, they've improved their training of the rangers, so they are far more equipped to deal with the situation than they were when this all started. The government has seen this as a priority, whereby it's actually almost a threat to national security, and therefore the Defence Force has been deployed in the Kruger National Park to support the rangers on the ground and try and secure our border with Mozambique as a result of the heavy losses that we're facing from a rhino perspective in the Kruger National Park.
In 2009, South Africa published a national moratorium on the sale of rhino horn and any derivatives or products within South Africa. This was enacted in order to curb the illegal trade in rhino horn and to discourage rhino poaching. South African government officials then noticed an increase in applications for hunting permits for white rhino from Vietnamese and Thai citizens. The majority of these applications resulted in pseudo-hunts, where the applicants were paid by a third party to carry out the hunts. The horns were then passed on to the third party once they had been exported from South Africa. To address this, the national norms and standards for the marking of rhino horn and the hunting of white rhino for trophy hunting purposes was published in July 2009. This effectively coordinated applications for hunting white rhino through the establishment of a national register. In 2011, an amendment was made to include the requirement that an applicant must provide proof that he or she is a bona fide hunter. It also became compulsory for the environmental management inspectors to be present at each and every white rhino hunt, and that DNA samples are taken from each animal hunted. These amendments had a significant impact on the number of applications for hunting of white rhino. In 2011, 222 applications were received, whereas in 2012 there were only 91. Applications from East Asian countries were practically nil. The National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa works closely with the country's law enforcement bodies. Recently, 20 prosecutors were assigned specifically to handle cases involving rhino poaching. The courts are starting to impose harsh sentences in a bid to deter offenders. A Thai citizen was recently convicted of the illegal trade of rhino horns obtained through pseudo-hunts and was sentenced to 40 years in jail. While South Africa is committed to protecting the white rhino, it requires the cooperation of other countries to assist in the investigation and prosecution of illegally traded rhino horn cases. South Africa also needs assistance in ensuring that legally imported rhino hunting trophies are not being sold or donated to third parties.
My name is Bandile Mkhize. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, which is the conservation agency for the province of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I am a firm believer in the sustainable use of natural resources. And I think I can speak with authority on that subject because of the fact that the organization that I preside over has got a very proud history in terms of sustainable use of natural resources. And this organization has also got a very proud history with regard to the conservation of rhino and white rhino in particular. And I'm proud to say that white rhino was saved in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in Hluhluwe Imfolozi Park. And as a province, we are very proud of that legacy. And the white rhino has contributed a lot to the development of this province economically. And because we've been using the white rhino in a sustainable manner, we are able to proudly say that we've conserved our rhino in the most appropriate way. And one way in which we've been generating funds, especially for communities, is to engage in rhino hunting, which is professionally organized and which is professionally monitored. Our permit system is going to be automated very soon. We are working on that. And I want to believe that our permit system is one of the best in the world. We are an organization that is very much stakeholder-centric. And most of our stakeholders come from the local communities. We have been responsible for establishing quite a number of reserves that are owned by communities. And we've been encouraging communities to engage hunting as part of revenue generation. It's like the communities next to Hluhluwe, the community of Makasa. And I'm proud to say that most of these communities can survive today because of the income that they generate from hunting, and white rhino hunting in particular. Makasa community is a community which depends a lot on natural resources. Last year alone, they generate close to R1 million from rhino hunting, which is money that they could have never generated if they did not have this natural resource that was going to bring them the money. And I'm talking about impoverished communities here whose lives are far below the poverty level. And because of the hunting industry, they have survived. So I don't believe for the life of me that there is any merit in the argument that says we should stop hunting of rhinos because of the problem of rhino poaching. I think these are mutually exclusive. We must fight rhino poaching head on and continue with the organized way of doing things that we've been doing over a number of years. As the province of KwaZulu-Natal, we've been in this game, I think, far longer than anybody else. Because of the number of rhinos that we have in KwaZulu-Natal and South Africa as a whole, we are the people that can speak authoritatively in terms of what should happen as far as rhino hunting is concerned. And we don't really need anybody else to tell us how to manage the rhinos that we have in abundance. And especially because these rhinos were saved by us from extinction. And I believe that it is important for us to continue that legacy. And it is important for us to emphasize that there is nothing wrong with the sustainable use of natural resources. And in this instance, there is nothing wrong with the hunting, the organized hunting of rhino under the watchful eye of our organization.
White rhino sales have been the biggest contributor to the total turnover at game auctions held by the Conservation Authority in KwaZulu-Natal province, where it accounted for 75% of the total turnover from 2008 to July 2011. The average price in 2011 was 234,000 South African rand. A downward trend was noticed at an auction in September 2012, where the prices for white rhino varied between 135,000 and 160,000 South African rand. If the Kenyan proposal is approved, there is little doubt that the live sale price of white rhino will fall even further. Private wildlife reserves that keep white rhino solely for ecotourism purposes will lose potential revenue generated from selling surplus animals for hunting purposes. State-owned protected areas would face the same problem, resulting in a reduction in revenue desperately needed for wildlife conservation purposes. A further consequence of the decline in the sale and subsequent introduction of rhinos to new areas would be the expected decline in the meta-population growth rate and overstocking in established populations. Surplus animals should be regularly removed from established populations to maintain productive densities and to provide founder animals that can be used to stock new areas. White rhino have already been introduced to all state-owned protected areas that are suitable for the species, and as such, the expansion of range and numbers is to a large extent dependent upon the economic incentives for the private sector and communities to conserve rhino.
In 2008, the first rhino were killed on private reserves in South Africa, and from that date we recognized in fact that there was no national body representing the needs of private rhino owners. There are some 400 properties in South Africa under private ownership with the rhino. The population of rhino, I'm referring specifically to the white rhino here, is over 5,000 animals, which in terms of the national herd puts us at about 27% of the national population. In terms of capital investment in rhino alone, the private sector represents some 1 billion rand of investment into rhino protection and preservation. That figure excludes land management costs, APU costs, etc. We have been at the coalface of the current poaching crisis in South Africa, whilst we represent some 27% of the population. Unfortunately, we are perceived as the soft target by poaching syndicates. We do not have the privilege of having the army or the police force to protect our borders. So the net result is that we are fighting off armed gangs. We have difficulty securing weaponry. So very often you have an APU unit going out with pepper spray, facing heavily armed gangs who are coming in at different times of day and night. They are sophisticated, they are well informed, and they are brutal in their conduct. Our situation is a desperate one. We are reliant on the economics of rhino to be able to justify and sustain the ownership of rhino. We are being attacked on various levels. First of all, we are losing a rhino. Some 35% of the national loss was from the private sector. If you work that back into rand terms, it's many hundreds of millions of rand that we have lost in assets. Secondly, that what a rhino was worth in 2008, and if you had to apply an inflationary figure to that, well, that animal should conservatively be worth at least 500,000 rand plus. Sadly, rhino have fallen to less than half that figure. So investor confidence in product rhino has fallen. We are now faced with incredibly high operational expenses, whereas before many reserves did not even have the need for anti-poaching units. There's a very well-known reserve in the Lowveld that historically we're running on an annual security budget of some 900,000 rand. That same reserve today has to find 4.5 million rand only in APU costs to protect their population. So where does the money come from? Due to the economic pressure that we are faced with as rhino owners, added to uncertainty, many rhino owners have now decided that they no longer wish to own rhino. And this results from the either direct loss of rhino having been killed on their property or the fear of further losses. So Whilst in the past we had some 400 members, our estimation, and we're busy with a survey on this at the moment, is that that figure has dropped now to about 350 to 360 properties, which means a loss of range for rhino of some 300,000 hectares of land. We are looking for assistance every which way to be able to justify to our owners as to why they should not give up the battle. And sadly, the timing of the Kenyan application to put forward a proposal for a zero quota means that you're taking away the economic viability of rhino ownership. You have seen across Africa, some 23 range states have lost all their rhino. We have lost in the region of 100,000 rhino. 100,000 carcasses, bleached bones in the African sun. That's a sad testimony to man's ineffective ability to bring an end to the scourge of Africa, which is poaching.
So what is so critical at this time is that while rhinos are becoming relatively less attractive to private owners because of the high risk of poaching, they need sources of income to protect their animals. And what we found is that over the years, the trophy hunting market has driven this steady increase in the price of live rhinos. Now, that meant that rhino breeding was attractive, not only to private owners, but also to the parks. The parks were also selling rhinos to the private sector. So this increased demand from trophy hunting, increased prices, drove the expansion of rhino populations. Now we're starting to see that reverse. Now, if we stop hunting, which still provides a very important source of income, we are going to see an even greater disincentive for private owners to own rhinos. And that is going to feed into the whole rhino market and not only adversely affect the private owners, but also adversely affect the state agencies who've been selling to the private owners. It's going to be like a whole house of cards. And the consequences for the whole wildlife, South Africa's wildlife economy, are potentially very damaging.
Although poaching is prevalent and increasing in South Africa, the number of live births still exceeds the number of deaths, including poached rhino. The national average growth rate of the white rhino population was just over 7% from 1991 to 2010, inclusive of animals lost to poaching. Approximately 4% of the national population is currently lost to poachers, well below the average net 7.2% rate of increase in the white rhino population. The South African population of white rhino does not meet the criteria for inclusion in Appendix 1 and is appropriately listed in Appendix 2 of CITES. If the proposal submitted by Kenya is voted for, it will result in a prohibition that is stricter than an Appendix 1 listing. The CITES Secretariat recommends that, based on the available information, the Kenya proposal be rejected, and so it should be. The time has come for common sense to prevail over emotional rhetoric, which has no place in dealing with the cold realities that face wildlife conservation in Africa today.